right, let's see if we can wait again for Luke and see if we can do this one more time. All right.
Perfect.
All right, is that better?
Yep, that's great. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. Okay, so as we were talking about earlier, graphic design, like in our passage of words fitly spoken, used correctly is very effective. And I was saying while we were waiting for you that I remember when great graphic design was colored paper, and we want to move people past that. And I'm amazed at how often I still see a white flyer with just black print on it for like gospel meetings and such. And with all the advancements today, I think it's kind of important to talk about these things, and it's an often overlooked part of our work. And so why does graphic design matter? Let's jump back to that. We were talking about that earlier. Does it matter? If you have the truth, after all, isn't that enough? Luke, what would you say to that?
I would say graphic design is extremely important, mainly because there are so many advertisements that we see every day. I mean, if you think about just scrolling on your phone, whether it's any kind of social media or internet, I mean, you're going to be seeing thousands of advertisements every day. So whenever if you're a company, if you're a church, whatever the case is, if you want people to notice you, you have to be aesthetically pleasing. Your branding has to look nice. Your logo has to look nice, because people are going to look right past it because they see hundreds of other branding efforts that might look a lot better than what you offer. So they're quickly going to look over that. When someone visits a website, it takes their brain 0.05 seconds for them to determine whether or not, just first impression, whether or not they like the website. And that's strictly all because of design. So it's very, very important, and it helps people to connect with your brand, and it could lead to, if you're a company, leads to more sales. But obviously we're talking about the church. So if we're talking about the church, then you want to have good graphic design everywhere, because you want them to feel welcome and not kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but just kind of looking for something more because your design was lacking.
Yeah, you used the word a while ago, branding, and we'll get to that more at the end, but explain maybe briefly what you mean by branding.
So when I say branding, I mean, and branding is more than just a logo, but branding, and our first conversation was more about this, and so it probably goes into more detail there. But when I talk about branding, I'm talking about what you want the mind, or what you want to be in the mind of whoever your target consumer is. So that's kind of the blanket definition I put behind that.
Yeah, and you talked about getting noticed and grabbing attention. We, even one of the things, it's not so much graphic design, but you helped us with our logo. We had a sign out by our road that was brown with white letters, and what happened then is nobody ever knew where our building was located. You've seen pictures of that sign. It was pretty generic and pretty bad. We just want to say that we replaced that with our logo, and now everybody knows where our building is because it's the church with the blue heart, and that's pretty amazing how that works. And so graphic design and design overall really does matter. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts, and we're just going to kind of get together as two kind of, I guess, design nerds and talk about a few things, and some things maybe people never thought about.
Maybe some things people don't want to think about.
Yeah, and some things that you really should think about.
Yes.
So the first thing is, I want to highly recommend a book to everybody who's not read it. It's called The Non-Designer's Design Book by Robin Williams. Not that Robin Williams, but another Robin Williams. And the reason I highly recommend, make sure if you do that, you get the one that's been printed in color. There's older editions that are black and white. I actually have one of both, but make sure you get one of the color editions, because the great thing about Robin Williams' book, the non-designer's design book, is it actually shows you bad design and then shows you good design.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is a book you're familiar with. We talked earlier, this was actually a textbook for you in college. You can generally pick it up at Barnes & Noble or order it from Amazon. It's pretty easy to get a hold of.
Yep.
But I think it's probably every preacher probably that does some graphic design stuff, if you don't have somebody doing that for you, you need to order this book and dedicate some time to it.
Oh yeah, I love that book. And what you kind of said at the end, no matter who you are, you need to get that book. One thing that's so interesting to me about graphic design is that everyone has an opinion on it. And maybe even more interesting is that everyone is willing to share their opinion on it. There's a reason I don't walk down the hallway in our office and go into someone who works in accounting and say, hey, let me tell you about something I think you're doing wrong. You need to fix something that you're doing wrong, because I don't know anything about that. It's the same reason when I go into the doctor's office, or if I, were to get surgery or something, I'm not going to question and go, well, should you have used that tool there? Maybe something else would have been a little better. But when it comes to graphic design, everyone has an opinion. Everyone is willing to share that opinion. And what people need to know is that it's a field that takes study and work and research to try to figure out what works in graphic design and what doesn't, just like any other field. So it's always been interesting. I'm sure you've experienced that same thing where people are going to tell you how they feel about something, and you're like, really? I'm not quite sure I agree with you on that. So
yeah, and it's interesting with that standpoint. Everybody has an opinion, and there's some allowance in there. Some people like some things better than others.
Sure.
And there's more than one way to do this, but there are some definite wrong things. So let's talk about some things we don't do, and we'll break them down in a couple of categories. So the first one I want to hit on is justification. This is one of the first, when you worked with me first summer, this is one of the first conversations I think we had, and we've had a joke about that for a while. What's so important about justification? For those who don't know, when you lay something out, there's 3 ways to justify something, generally speaking. Really 4, I guess. One is hard line left. One is hard line right. Then there is center justification, which seems to be really popular among women. And, and there's also, you can do full justification. So why does that matter, Luke? What's the big deal about justification?
So what matters is it's all about how the brain works and how your eye reads something on the paper. So there's a reason whenever you pick up a book that's been produced by a huge publishing company who produces a bunch of books every year, there's a reason that all of their books are either left justified or left aligned, because they understand that your eye, when you're reading something, it wants to see some kind of definite line somewhere. So what I see a lot, especially with church flyers, is that it'll typically be some kind of center alignment. Sometimes center alignment can be fine. It's not that I'm necessarily totally all against it, but I think sometimes we fall into the trap of never trying to do anything more than just, let's just center it because that's what people are comfortable with and that's what they expect. But the benefit of either left justifying or left aligning something or right aligning it is that you do something that's a little bit different. And that is important because, like we talked about earlier, there's thousands of advertisements, thousands of things being pushed in our face. So we have to think, how can I do something that's a little bit different? How can I set this graphic design apart, whether it's a flyer, logo, whatever it may be? So that's just a simple way to get someone's attention by not centering it or maybe putting it to the left or the right.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. When I first looked at this concept, and Williams goes over this in the book, I probably used center justify maybe a little too much. And when I started looking in the book at that and then started looking and playing around with my own, it's amazing how even a right line justify is so much better than center justify and the way it works with your head. One of the things, if you're designing something, I would recommend that you draw a line. And so draw a line down one side or the other and make everything justify to that line.
Mm-hmm.
Even different text boxes. Don't have like 4 or 5 boxes floating out in the space of your flyer or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But rather, it's the idea of anchoring. And if you anchor everything to one side, whether it's left or right, your mind automatically just adjusts to that far better than this center justification that looks like a bunch of jagged lines all over the page.
Yeah.
So as a general rule, you should not use center justification that often.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe on a title page for a book, that's one appropriate place. But outside of that, there are very few places I can think of just off the top of my head that center justification is kind of what we should do.
And I think especially when there's going to be a lot of text. If it's like, I mean, at least in my opinion, if it's going to be the title of something, of like a title of a book or a series where there's not paragraphs of text under that, then I think centering that would be fine. I think it just all depends on the circumstance. But for the majority of the time, yes, I think you're right on that putting something on the left or the right is just going to be more effective.
Yeah, so that was an easy one. So let's go to one of the more technical ones that may bore people, but it's very important. So I want you to listen very carefully. Let's talk fonts for a minute. Let's talk the don'ts first.
Yeah.
Don't. I'll just start us off with one, and maybe we should trade back and forth.
Okay.
So here's my first don't. Don't ever use Times New Roman. Ever.
Yeah.
Under any circumstances. That used to be the default, and probably if you open Word and you've not changed your default, it could be the default. It used to be a requirement, by the way, in college. I had to write papers in Times New Roman. Not that I don't think many of our professors actually knew the difference between say that and a Cambria, but I think it's interesting. Just never use Times New Roman. Bad idea. Always a bad idea. So that would be my first font to throw out there. Paul Hammonds is adding Helvetica. That's probably because Helvetica is the Apple default, and so since it's a default, it's overused.
Yep.
Although I will admit to using Helvetica on my sermon outlines because it is a little easier to read, but not in publications. So that was my first one, and Paul adds one. What would you add in there? Another font not to use?
Well,
we could go back and forth for days.
Oh, I know. But the one thing about Helvetica, and this is probably the nerdiest thing I'll ever share on Do the Work, but there is a documentary on Helvetica, and I have watched it. And I'm a little ashamed to admit that I really liked it and was kind of fascinated by it. But not only is Helvetica Apple's font, but it's the font of so many other companies that we don't even realize. So it's not that it's necessarily, it's a great font typeface. It's beautiful. So that's not the problem. The problem is that it's just overused. So another font for me would be Papyrus. It's somehow, and that one I'm just not going to say it's a good font. I'm just going to say it's a terrible one. I don't know why it's so overused. If you think of the movie Avatar, that title is in the Papyrus font, and you'll see that font on different kinds of flyers for all different kinds of reasons, and it just never makes sense.
I would add Comic Sans to that. Never, under any circumstances, use Comic Sans.
Yeah.
It is the favorite font of 6-year-olds, and so if you use it, then you are automatically 6.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're advertising a 6-year-old birthday party, Comic Sans is out. Yeah.
Paul Hammonds apparently is a very big fan of Papyrus. Stop using Papyrus, Paul. That's a terrible font. Now, as far as, and we could go on, I mean, there's some Arial's a font that is, again, overused. I will say that Cambria and Calibri are 2 Microsoft fonts that overall aren't bad, and I generally use them myself on PowerPoint presentations for this reason alone.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who've not dealt with this, you'll be very careful taking your PowerPoint to another place. Because they may not have your same font package downloaded.
Yeah.
But if you use one of the Microsoft standard fonts like Calibri or Cambria, you're always going to be able to use those fonts. Cambria is a serif and the Calibri is a sans serif, and you kind of need to find a couple of serif and a couple of sans serif fonts that you'll use as far as that goes. Now, as far as any other don't use fonts that you can think of real quick?
No, not really.
I would say anything script, by the way. Almost anything script is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to read.
I think maybe one tip for people if they want to go out and find good fonts would be to use Google Fonts. So Google has their own font database, and what's nice about that is that you can download all the fonts that they have on there for free, and you can go on there and see fonts that are trending and relevant and popular. And 99% of the time, those are going to be great fonts. And the great thing about that is if you're using them in a PowerPoint, you can download that, package that all in a file, and you've got those fonts included with you. So that's a great way to go find new fonts instead of just scrolling through the font menu on PowerPoint and kind of guessing.
Yeah, the other thing is be very careful about downloading free fonts from the 1001 free font places.
Yeah,
I would rather use Google Fonts, or if you happen to be an Adobe, have an Adobe subscription, which we'll talk about that in a moment. That's a great place to get fonts.
Yep.
And they also will let you know what's trending, and they add new fonts pretty regularly. So some service like that is a tremendous help when it comes to design. One of the things to do about fonts too, and this is kind of a do and a don't. Generally speaking, on a printed document especially, but also I would add PowerPoint, website, everything, don't use more than 2 fonts at a time.
Yep.
It's okay to mix them up, but don't use more than 2 fonts. Now you can get in the font family. There's a font I like to use called Myriad Pro. I know you've seen that one before that has, and I probably overused that. But one of the things I like about Myriad Pro is it has a narrow and a standard width, and that makes it easier. So there was a time that I was a big Myriad and Warnock fan all the time, although I've got away from that. You can laugh about that if you want, but those were two pretty good fonts at the time.
Yeah.
So but don't use more than 2. Be careful with your italics, be careful with your bold, those kind of things. You got to use that stuff sparingly or it becomes ineffective. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And something I'd add on top of that is there's really no need to ever use the underline tool. That was invented for the press when we were still printing things on like a big printing press, and there wasn't a way to bold a word, so they had to underline it, and that unfortunately has carried over into computers. So I think the best thing to do if you want to emphasize a word is either pick a heavier weight of that font. So if you're using Myriad Pro, you could use Myriad Pro Bold, or you can just see if whatever you're using, Microsoft PowerPoint, you can sometimes just bold the word itself. And that's a much better way to emphasize a word than using the underline tool.
Yeah. Don Clemens asks this question: what's the best font for a bulletin? I think that could be different. I think generally speaking, serif fonts are viewed as more readable in those paragraph formats. So I would stick with something like that. And that would depend on what fonts you have and what you're laying that out in as well. What kind of fonts would you recommend for a bulletin?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So especially in paragraph form, serif fonts are much, much better because, and when we say serif, we're talking about like Times New Roman would be serif, Helvetica would be sans serif. So when we're talking about a serif font, we're talking about sometimes it'll have like a little tail on the end of the letters. In serif and sans serif fonts, it'll just be straight to the bottom, kind of no frills. So in a bulletin, I would think for your headings, a sans serif font would work really, really well. And then, and maybe bold that and keep that font as kind of your heading font. And then for your body text, I would definitely use a serif font. And you could go to Google and find some of the more popular ones right now. And what's nice about Google Fonts is that you can type in a sentence and see how it looks in all of their different fonts. So you can kind of get an idea of how your bulletin would look right there. So that's a nice tool. But yeah, that's what I would say to that question.
Yeah, and I would advise everybody that in your bulletin should only use 2 font families. So again, you go back to that. You can use different line depths or variations like bold, semi-bold. You can italicize if you need to, but choose one serif font and one serif sans serif font and stick to those for the entire bulletin, however long that is. By the way, that's what books do. You pick up a book, they don't change fonts by chapters or by pages. So you want to make your bulletin look the same way. Again, as Luke said, sans serif doesn't have the little tails on the letters, and serif has those little tails on the letters, and that's kind of what you want to look for. So again, 2 fonts per document. Choose something, go to Google, choose something, but try to stick with that too. Don't try to mix that up. Earlier, Paul Hammond said anything that looks fun is probably a bad idea. And in some ways, I think that's probably a good hint or a tip there. I would add it this way: if it looks like it came out of Photoshop back in the 90s, then it's probably not the font you want to use. Just as a general rule, for those who don't remember, Photoshop was like what every mom had to make her own cards at home with her printer. And there was a lot of really neat little fonts that went along with that. Not the best professional looking as far as a bulletin board. So let's talk color, because we are in the color age, and you may not print in color all the time, but color is an important thing, and I don't think people realize how color plays an important role. So how would you choose colors, Luke, in when it comes to design? If you're going to do something full color, what are some guidelines for that?
Well, the first thing I think about is if we're designing this for a church, so let's think about our logo first. So before we start just throwing all kinds of neat colors out on a bulletin or any kind of flyer, let's think about the logo first, because that's typically what we think of when we think, what's the first thing people are going to see? They're probably going to see the logo somewhere. So all colors have some kind of emotion behind them, and you can go online and just kind of type in, emotion colors, or what's the emotion behind this color. So blue kind of gives a very calming effect. Red obviously would be the opposite of that. So whenever you're thinking about the brand and the logo and the color, you've got to think, okay, you got to be honest with yourself and ask yourself the question, what kind of emotion do I want to put in someone's mind when they see my logo? And that will kind of help you nail down what color would be best to put in your logo.
Yeah, the word that red brings to mind is the word offensive, and you don't realize that until you look at maybe something that's done in bright red. And there's a reason why fire trucks are in red. They get your attention, they grab your attention, they alarm you. You carry that emotion with other uses of the color red. So you have to think about that. And there's things I think people don't realize. Blue is a more calming, soothing effect, like you said. And it's also interesting to point out that not all blues are blue. There's like going to the paint department. When my wife goes to pick paint, she wanted to paint a room gray. I didn't know there was that many different colors of gray. And the same is with blue. And when you get into the design, especially if you have a logo, you want to make sure that if you can find out, there's a couple of ways to do this, but find out your exact color of your logo and try to use that as much as you can. Maybe it's the Pantone number, and that's one way, or maybe it's there's 2 different markers. CYMK is one, and that's how print media is done. And RGB is how broadcast media is done. Red, green, blue. CYMK is what? Cyan, yellow, magenta. I forgot the K. Anyway, from that standpoint, make sure that you find out the way to do that. And even in documents like PowerPoint, if you have the RGB, you can enter in the codes for the RGB and get the exact same color from another document that way, and make sure you're using the exact color. Again, that's a really nerdy thing to say, but it will make a huge difference if you actually pay attention to those kind of things. Because if you don't and use like 8 different kinds of blue, then you've not really followed your logo and the branding that's the right way.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
So did you mention hex code? I'm not sure if I heard you talk about that one.
I did not mention hex code.
Yeah, so that's the one.
Yeah.
I use that all the time. So you can find that out. So if you have a logo, there's websites you can go. If you can just say, go to Google and type in find hex code from image. You can upload your image to that website, and it'll kind of give you a magnifying glass to go over a certain color. Click on the color, and it'll tell you what your hex code is. And a lot of times, if you want things printed, that's always a good number to have in mind, because a lot of designers and printers will want to know what is your hex code, because that's a very, very exact color, and that'll help you kind of keep that consistent.
Yeah. Phil, who's watching us, even though he can't be with us, asks, is there a rule of thumb for complements and contrast? And I'm assuming he means in regards to color.
Yeah. Honestly, off the top of my head, if there's a rule of thumb, I don't know if there's like a rule of thumb I can think about, but typically when you think about like the color wheel, and you think about the complements and colors of that, that might be a good thing to look up. So if you decide, okay, I want my logo to be blue, so then you need to go look up the color wheel and the complements and all of that and try to decide, okay, what would be a nice complementary color for this blue? So I don't know if that really answers this question. I don't have a good rule of thumb for that.
No, I don't either. I just know that I have my own opinion of what looks good together and what doesn't.
Yep.
And I think a lot of that is, truthfully, with design, you have to develop an eye for this. And one of the ways, we're actually being trained all the time for that. Just driving down the road with signs and watching TV, we're actually being trained all the time what good design looks like. Although there's sometimes some amazingly bad design we also get to see.
Yeah.
But stay away from, you got to understand the offensive colors. Yellow, red are offensive colors, for instance. Don't use those as your primary color. Make sure that you need to be very careful about that. Paul says, would you recommend using the same color but a different saturation or transparency? Sometimes, Paul, I know our heart has 4 pieces and it's 4 different shades of a blue. I'm a little hesitant on the transparency, because here's what happens with transparency. Whatever's behind it changes the color. And so if you choose a transparency, you're not actually choosing a pure color. If you put white behind it or black, it's going to be 2 different colors based on that transparency. So I would make sure I had my own hex code or Pantone color to make sure it's a definitive color. Then you can manipulate transparency within a document later on the way you want to. But overall, messing with transparency is a dangerous thing.
Yep. I agree.
As that
agree with that. Yeah.
Because you can't control what it's going to look like. Phillip says again, what about folks with vision impairments? Look, colorblind people are a real big deal. And so for that reason, although there's not a lot of them out there, but it's enough of a problem that if you didn't know it, iPhone has a colorblind mode, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I
be careful with your reds and greens.
Yeah, I think about, because people think Christmas. So be careful with that just for that reason alone. But I mean, I'm in the senior living industry, so I'm constantly designing for people who have either limited vision or vision that wasn't as good as it once was. And so what I design a lot is typically a lot of things with high contrast, because they need to be able to pick up something and see right off the bat, this is different than that, and they need to be able to find exactly where the text is. So maybe you worship at a place where there's lots of older people. That's something that you might want to keep in mind is, okay, I'm not designing this with all my letters spaced out like Apple does, because Apple's not targeting that group in their design. So your design is going to be very, very different. You're going to want maybe bigger font in your bulletin. You might want your font to be a little bit bigger on your PowerPoint. Definitely maybe think even more about the serif font. You might want to use that even more, because overall it's just easier for people to pick up the individual letters of a serif font than a sans serif font.
Yeah, and add to that about contrast. If you're traveling in a gospel meeting and you have no idea what the PowerPoint projector's capabilities are, always use a big contrast in the background because we've all been in that situation where we load it up. We're like, hey, on my computer monitor, that looks great. and you get in there and it's an old bulb and an old projector and it doesn't have a lot of lumens and you can't see anything and it's useless. Just think about that and keep that in mind. Those are different things there as well. Let's talk software, and I think that's a situation that a lot of people probably haven't thought of. I mentioned print shop earlier. If you're still doing flyers in print shop, just stop. Basically for all of us.
Yeah.
You and I use pretty much the same software. It has a learning curve to learn it. If you have the willingness to invest time into the Adobe software, and specifically the two that come to mind that are the most used for these things would be InDesign and Photoshop. I think you'll immediately become more comfortable with one or the other. I'm an InDesign guy because I was a print guy. And I think it translates well for most of what I do.
Yep.
There's a fee for that. I will tell you that fee's a lot cheaper than it used to be. It's a subscription-based service, but you can either choose just one, or you can choose the entire collection of Adobe software, depending on how much you use that stuff. Yep. I'd say a rung below that would probably be Microsoft Publisher, which I'm not a fan of, but that is better than a lot of other options. And then well below that is Word. Actually, Pages, if you have Mac, is better than Word for this. But
you're going to start some fights with that.
I know. And so let me just say this. Microsoft Office, no part of Microsoft Office, except for if you got the expanded version with Publisher, no part was made for publishing. Word is just a word processor, which is really just meant for black and white print. I know there's some people that you and I love who really like text art, but it was not intended to be used this way. And you can't comment on that, I understand. But I would also add, PowerPoint is popular among some to publish stuff. It just wasn't designed for that. And it has some severe limitations for this. Adobe InDesign is what the industry uses across the board for the most part. You can lay something out and send your InDesign file to a printer, and they will have everything they need in that when you send it and package it. So what are your thoughts on that? I'm sure you're probably in agreement on most of that.
Yes, yeah. I spend probably on an average about 2 hours a day in InDesign. So if anyone has any questions, if you're using it and you can't figure out how to do something, let me know. Chances are I know how to do it, or I know the right people who do know how to do it. So I love InDesign. It can be a little daunting because I think Word, because typically people think, Word and InDesign are on the same page when really they're not. But when you open up Word, it appears a lot more user-friendly. And when you open up InDesign, it's like I thought Word had a lot of buttons, but this has a crazy number of options and things to do. So it can be a little daunting, which is unfortunate, because that keeps people from a great program sometimes. But yeah, I love InDesign. Look, like Paul talked about, the use of audio and video. I use Adobe Premiere Pro a lot, which is really, really nice. So again, that takes a kind of a learning curve too. It's more advanced than Apple iMovie or Windows Movie Maker, I think is what they call it. Yeah, I love the Adobe suite. I use Illustrator on a daily basis. That's really used when you make a logo. Most people would use Adobe Illustrator to do that. It's
correct.
It's really just made for artists and graphic designers.
And if you have something like a sign done, they want your Adobe Illustrator file if you can give it to them.
Yep.
For those reasons. And Paul is right. There's a lot of tutorials out there for Adobe products. YouTube is filled with them. Most problems you have, you could Google and you can find a solution quickly. But this kind of gives you an idea. When you open Word, you can just start typing away on Word. You open a document in InDesign, you cannot. You have to draw the text box first and then get the cursor inside the text box. And there's a reason for all of that, and it's easy once you learn that. But I remember the first time I opened it up, before I had taken any lessons on it, I tried to start typing. I'm like, why won't this thing work?
Yeah.
Because it's not a word processor.
Right. Because
design
InDesign does not start with any assumptions. When you open up Word, it starts with the assumption that you want to start typing with an inch from the left and an inch from the top in the top left-hand corner. When you open up InDesign, you have to first set the margins, the bleed on the document, because they don't start with assumptions. They assume that you know what you're coming there to do.
Correct. So that again is the highest of the high, and not everybody's willing to take that on. But if you want to do good stuff, and let me say this, with a good copier and InDesign, you can together basically become your own in-house publishing place, and with very few. We outsource a few things, but not very many, because you can do most of that on the side yourself in-house. A couple of comments. Hammond says to write your copy in Word and then import it. I don't do that. I just type in InDesign, but I've done that for so long.
Yep.
And I think you're like that too, that I'm used to that. BJ Young says lynda.com updates a comprehensive essentials class on all the major Adobe programs every year. Also good advice as far as that goes. And be careful what you say, because Lucy's mom is now watching. Just want to make sure you know that.
I was going to say about copying text from Word into InDesign. I have done that before. I've started it in whether it's Word or any other program besides InDesign. Sometimes you got to be careful with that, because if you just copy and paste it, you could lose any kind of emphasis you put on words. So if you bolded something over here, doesn't necessarily mean InDesign is going to pick that up. So I would be very, very careful doing that.
Yeah, if I was going to type it anywhere besides InDesign, I would actually use InCopy, but that's a little bit difficult as well. So I'd rather just type it in InDesign. So we're about out of time. Let's wrap it up with, let's talk logos for a minute. We've mentioned logos and branding. You talked about the need for design. I know a lot of people are really iffy about logos. We have one here. We had one where I was at in Memphis. They're very distinctly different, the two. The one there was an outline of a building. That's just what was there at the time. Ours here is a little bit different. It's a heart, and it represents something specific. If you guys want to see that, you can go to the Chelsea Church Christ website, and you can see that. So let's talk logos for a minute. Why do you think churches need to use logos? Why do you think that's so good?
I think it's so good, partly just, first of all, because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, with so many companies, businesses, nonprofits, churches trying to advertise toward us, that if churches don't have some kind of identity, people will never notice as they're driving by, as they're scrolling through the web. They simply won't notice you. So you could have a great website, but if your website is listed on Facebook and it has just the word Church of Christ as the profile picture or whatever it might say, people will easily just scroll right on through that. Whereas if you have a logo that's nice, welcoming, warm, however you want to describe that, there's a better chance that people will stop and look at it and at least think for a moment, do I want to click on this or do I not want to? So when you have at least a brand or an identity, you're giving yourself a chance. If you don't have that, you're pretty much ruling out any possibility of someone clicking on you for more information. So I think it's very, very important for that reason, because we're just hit with thousands of marketing messages every single day.
Yeah, and your logo can actually tie a lot of the things together that we've talked about, and that's why we've mentioned it so much. But for instance, in our logo, there's two different fonts used. So they're not common fonts that I could use in PowerPoint, and even probably in the publishing of our bulletin at this point, because we don't use Adobe for that. We may at some point. But for things that we do, like meeting flyers and those kind of things, we can incorporate those two fonts and use them as our core fonts. And then our colors, they're going to be our base colors for everything. They're going to come from the color of our logo, which is 4 different shades of blue. Yep. And so the branding becomes easier when you know your hex code or your Pantone colors, when you know your fonts families to use. Those your logo can end up directing your kind of design path in other areas, whether it's your letterhead, whether it's signs out front, whether it's whatever you may hand out. Your logo can be really your foundation for all of that.
Yep.
When it comes to colors and fonts.
Yep. Yeah, and even thinking about your website, it's always a good place to start when you think, how do I want my website to look? Whether you're using WordPress or Congregate, when you had Eric on, when you start with your logo, you have a starting point. You know, okay, here are my 2 or 3 colors or whatever. Here's the font that I want to use, and let Eric know. Say, hey, here's the color, here's the hex code, here's the font, because he can help you pull all of that into your website and make that kind of united in that way, and that looks really, really nice.
Yeah. Let's wrap it up real quick. We kind of talked about a lot of things, but go back to that passage I used from Proverbs, that a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and settings of silver. You know, that idea is the right word at the right time is irreplaceable. It's precious. It's priceless. And I think graphic design is that way as well, that when done correctly, it is really effective and it is priceless in what it can accomplish. Yep. Now, let me mention this to those who are watching, maybe that you struggle with some of this stuff. Luke is his professional secular job obviously is in PR and marketing, but on the side, he actually helps people and would be willing to help anybody in the areas of design. If you needed a logo, if you needed some kind of consulting on how do we take this to the next step to help us as far as design goes, and how could they get in touch with you if they wanted to talk to you about those things, Luke?
Sure. I could put my email address in the comment section, but if you're listening and want to write this down, you could email me at luke@givinghost.com. Or you could go to my website, givinghost.com. A lot of it will just look like it's website hosting, but that's something I'm currently updating to include more of some of the graphic design work that I've done and some more explanation about that.
Yep. Anything to add, Luke, to our discussion today?
Just that, thanks for having me on, and I'm glad we're talking about this. It's so important, and I wish people would pay more attention to it. And so, yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks for joining us today, Luke. Really appreciate it. And always good to talk to you, but especially love to tap into your brain on the design and the PR stuff. And appreciate your help today. And for those who watch, thank you. Next week, Phil should be joining me again. And if you have anything you'd like for us to cover in the future, as always, give us some feedback and send us a private message through Do The Works page here on Facebook. And we'll try to take care of that in the near future. Thanks, Luke.
Yep. Thanks, Terry.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.